Okay, Tamsin.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to set out in a bit more detail around why the UK government is interested in this agenda and touch on some of the initiatives that we're involved with and go into a bit more detail, as Sam was saying, around the Capital Markets Climate Initiative. So first of all, just to set a bit of context here, as I was saying, as to why it is that we're looking from a government perspective around the agenda on leveraging private capital to address climate change. The first one is very much around the commitment that was made in Cancun around mobilising $100 billion per annum by 2020, which was locked into the LCA text at Cancun and includes both public and private finance. So on one level, it's looking at that political commitment and how can we deliver that. The second is actually thinking through more on the demand side, and the fact that actually successful economic transition to low carbon growth requires private sector investment. And if we look at the scale of investment that's required, it is significantly more than the 100 billion we are talking about. So, for example, the IEA a couple of years ago flagged $197 billion worth of incremental investment required on the low carbon agenda. Within that, also UNFCCC a few years ago flagged that the private sector will have a key role within this, looking at 85% of the finance coming from the private sector. Lastly, in terms of the actual supply and the potential for the capital markets to deliver here, through the work of the high-level advisory group, for example, is identified that you could be looking at up to $500 billion worth of potential investment flows coming from the private sector on the low-carbon agenda. Equally, some work that was done by HSBC recently, which flagged that by 2020 you could be looking at a market on the low-carbon goods and services of $2.2 trillion. And in India alone, they flagged a $135 billion market by 2020 could be potential. So with that in mind, just to flag some of the areas that the UK government's been involved with. So the first one around the advisory group on climate change finance, as I was mentioning before. The remit of that was looking at how do you actually mobilise the $100 billion, and an element of that was looking at the private finance side. And we were involved initially as co-chair under Gordon Brown, and then as a member through Chris Huhne. Secondly, on the actual finance architecture, and the UK is now confirmed as a member of the Transitional Committee involved in the design of the Green Climate Fund, which was announced at Cancun. And within that, we see a key role for the GCF in looking at how best can you leverage private capital to ensure that you get the maximum bang for your buck in terms of delivering on the low-carbon agenda and the climate resilient agenda. Thirdly, we have our public climate finance. So in the last spending review, we committed to provide by 2014-15, so from now through to 2014-15, £2.9 billion on international climate finance. And again, one of the objectives we have for that money is around leveraging private capital. And for example, you could be looking at instruments such as the CP3 fund, which Gid will be talking about in a moment. And then finally, looking at this from the policy side of things, and it very much plays into, as Dirk Willem was setting out on that push-pull factor, on looking at the role of the public sector to help to catalyse and leverage private sector investment. So just to touch on first some of the key messages that came out of the advisory group on climate change finance, because that helped set the context for where the CMCI came out. And so I just pulled out some of the key messages that came out. Firstly, that the private sector has a huge role to play within this, and again, that the challenge isn't going to be delivered unless you can get the private sector to the table. And there's a clear role for the public sector here, both in terms of the amount of finance that can be used to leverage this action, and in particular looking at the role of the MDBs within this to help deliver. And this picks up on both Andre's presentation and also on Dirk Willem's. Secondly, on the need to overcome a range of existing barriers, so whether those are country or project specific, and again, as Andre flagged, there's a wide range of barriers that need to be addressed. Another element which isn't flagged here is also thinking about the enabling environment, and this is one of the key messages as well, is that you can put these different mechanisms in place, etc., to address some of these risks, but you've got to create the right enabling environment to actually attract that investment and create a longer-term opportunity, longer-term markets. And finally, just as I was saying before, I mean, the figure we have here of the $102 to $200 billion of international private capital flows, This is because when the AGF was being written, we focused in terms of the total amount that could be raised, which was up to 500 billion, and then extracting from that what proportion would you see as being international and what proportion may be coming from developing country private investors. So as I was saying, that sets the context for where the CMCI really originated from. Both in terms, on one side, that you had the AGF being strong drivers to how do you mobilise climate finance, and a strong element of that on the public finance side. And the view from the Minister Barker was saying, you know, it's fantastic that you look at the public sector side, but you also need to have a strong drive on the private finance side as well. So how do we actually make this happen? And that's where the Capital Markets Climate Initiative came out. And secondly, picking up some of those messages from the AGF, you know, what is it that CMCI should be addressing given the recommendations of the AGF? So given that, the discussions we've been having over the last few months on the CMCI is to make sure we're getting the right pitch and thinking through, you know, where can we add the most value with this initiative? And one of the clear messages is it's time to get practical. We've done a lot of the theory, a lot of the talking, but now we've got to get on to the action. Now there's two elements within this. On one side, it's about moving on to implementation through programs and projects and actually trialling this in practice to see what is the role of the public sector and the private sector to deliver. But another element of this is how do you work with policymakers to help ensure that where the private sector is saying, look, these are the types of policy frameworks we need, these are the types of public finance interventions we need, how to ensure that is translated and understood by the public sector, but also in terms of coming into issues around public value considerations. You know, there's a wide range of different measures and mechanisms that are identified. Which is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck? And helping to get some of that dialogue going between the public and the private sector. So in terms of the expected outputs, given the practical focus I was setting out, there are three main deliverables we're really looking at with the CMCI. The first is about developing a set of principles and toolkits. So again, working with policymakers, but bringing private sector to the table, you know, how do we improve that understanding of what works, where has it worked, and what do you actually need to do in practice to make this happen? Secondly, creating these proof points to actually demonstrate, does this work in practice? So on one side, we're talking about, you know, aggregating, looking across the piece onto the experience of different initiatives, processes, programs, etc., but also trialing this out through live implementation. So you demonstrate both the impact of of public action, but also the commercial viability to the private sector. And finally, on the advisory inputs, as I mentioned before, we are a member of the Green Climate Fund, and this provides an opportunity to get the views and feedbacks of the private sector in terms of what does that type of fund, how could that be constructed to actually help to leverage private capital. So just to go into a bit more detail then on the proposed approach, there's really three main elements to this. Firstly, about research and analysis. And this is very much the case. We need to pull together a lot of the work that has already been produced and not replicate and duplicate what's already out there. But also within that, trying to pull together a lot of the experience that individual institutions, individual banks, individual DFIs, etc., have in this space, and try and pull that together and extract what are the key experiences and the lessons that have come out from this. What's worked, what hasn't worked. You know, let's not repeatedly keep on doing trial by error, etc., and actually work out, you know, what are the common factors which have been successful, common factors that haven't been so successful, and try and pull that together. Second piece, around the public-private dialogue. So as I was saying, there's a lot of work that's been done by the private sector in terms of calling for different types of public action and trying to foster a much stronger engagement between the public and the private sector in terms of taking those recommendations and putting them into a practical focus and thinking through issues around the public value considerations. How do you get the maximum impact with the public finance that's being put on the table? And finally, about actually, as I was saying before, trying this out in practice, so real application and implementation. And we're looking to deliver this through two working groups. The first one focusing very much on those first 2 points on the research and analysis and the dialogue and consultation with a wide group of stakeholders from a wide range of countries to try and pull together those lessons and experience and produce that into a set of guidelines. The second working group is about taking this into the country, so working with between 2 to 4 different developing country partners who've expressed a real interest to work on this agenda and deliver their low carbon, whether it's their growth strategy or specific programs or projects within that, and seeing a role for the private sector. And that will both help to test and improve those policies, those principles and toolkits, but also in terms of providing that proof point. In terms of what this might actually look like in process, and I must say this relates to everything on the CMCI at the moment. This is very much work in progress, and we're going through a process of kind of talking to different stakeholders to get different views as to how this can be most effective. But I think one of the areas in particular that, as we get into the detail, we're trying to refine is how might this actually look in country. And the likelihood is you're probably looking at a combination of a top-down approach in some countries, so where countries in the process of designing their low-carbon growth strategies, where CMCI may be able to apply a useful role in terms of thinking, well, how can that be designed in such a way that can attract that private sector investment? Through to the bottom up in terms of where you're delivering programs and projects, how can you bring together the expertise and also the potential of bringing public climate finance to the table to actually make these programs happen? And so this is just a brief illustration to show that the process is very much an iterative one between the two working groups. So kind of sharing the lessons and experience. And it may well be that a first stage is focusing on that research and application in country, and a second stage is actually pulling out those messages onto the toolkit. So then just to pick up on the membership side, and just give some detail on that. At the moment, it's being led very much by UK government and with Minister Greg Barker in the driving seat of this. But it's also with strong participation from other departments within HMG, so in particular with DFID and with Treasury, but also working with colleagues in the Foreign Office and going forward with our BIS colleagues as well. We have financial sector representatives from across the financial chain, so ranging from the banks, institutional investors, insurance companies, stock exchanges, credit rating agencies, etc. So getting that wide range of different experiences, exposure and perspectives that we can bring to bear. We also have development finance institutions as members within this. So for example, EBRD, EIB, IFC, World Bank, etc. And then within that also some experts on the financial and the climate change and private sector side. Going forward, as we refine that work programme and ensure that we have something that's both realistic but also helps push this agenda forward, we'll be looking at other key stakeholders we need to engage with. So other interested governments, both developed and developing countries, developing country banks, developing country pension funds and other domestic capital. And I think this was one of the key things that's come out, is it's not just about the international private sector, but very much about engaging with the national private sector and how they may be interested in deploying their finance in their own country, in their own low carbon investments. And then through to project developers and pension fund consultants. Now, as I flagged, this is very much an early stage within CMCI, and it is work in progress. But we hope over the next few weeks to really be developing and refining this work programme and talking to a wide range of stakeholders as to where can we add the most value, given that combination of having government leadership, the expertise that you have, the scope for financial solutions with the City of London, and also with the ICF, so the UK's public climate finance, which can also help to actually make some of these investments actually happen. So please, if people have views and thoughts, we'd very much welcome those. And the plan is over, as I said, by May to be in a stage where we can actually start doing the work around this. Thank you.
Great. Tamsin, thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be some questions and suggestions in a minute on that. But lastly, we have Deirdre, who's going to talk about, from a private sector advisor perspective in